Hi guys, hold on for a second. Before we proceed to the video, I have something very important to tell you. Professor Jon V. Kofas has published his new book in collaboration with Little French Media, and the title of the book is Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism. This book details how neoliberalism impacts the geopolitical economy in the 21st century. You can buy it from Amazon and the link is in the description. Thank you. Now let's proceed to the video.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is an overview, summary of a video session I did on violence in society, a topic about which a great deal has been written by historians, sociologists, criminologists, political scientists. So there are all sorts of people, human rights activists, and journalists, obviously. The topic is very important because the social contract of every society very much influences the level of violence in society. Now, in this video that I hope all of you will watch, I differentiate between behavioral individual violence, usually person to person, involving invariably, in many cases, friends and relatives at the neighborhood level, um, versus in petty crimes, basically, versus structural systemic violence, which is the result of public policy, whether it is the inadvertent result or intentional. The most obvious, the most obvious form of structural violence throughout history has been war. That is not the fault of any individual. This is part of policy. Those who make policy decisions to go to war impose violence on a mass scale on innocent people, especially civilians, considering that the victims of war are primarily civilians, either intentionally, as in some wars, or, which by the way is a war crime, or unintentionally as war casualties. There are scholars who believe that all wars without exception throughout history have been civilians. Okay. Now, structural violence is more of my focus in this longer video than individual violence, but I do talk about individual violence as well as the culture of violence. For example, there is a gun culture in the United States. And as those who follow the random violence of gun enthusiasts very well know, the victims there are people in a mall, in a school, in a post office, wherever they are, whether it's in a place of work or business or whatever. That is the result of individual violence, invariably of someone who is usually mentally ill, by the way. Although there are those who are ideologically driven as well. So let's can't count that out. But ideologically driven to such a degree that the mental state of the individual carrying out such random acts of violence against people they don't even know, they have nothing against them, or they may know them and they think that they're at fault for something. So the element of paranoia enters into the picture. That kind of violence it is true, that has always taken place. um, behavioral individual violence. However, structural violence provokes individual violence, and it has throughout history. And there is a correlation between militarism and authoritarian states, or even if they're not authoritarian, but they claim to be democratic, but to actually pursue policies relying heavily on authoritarian tactics and police state methods. Those societies have a problem of violence at the individual level as it filters down to the individual and provokes them into violence. Structural violence is, for example, it's not just in the public sector, it's also in the private sector, businesses. When some company, corporation lays off people, they can't meet payments. They are unable to sustain themselves and their families. They may result to acts of violence. This is a topic about which scholars and novelists have dealt about from the 17th and 18th century to the present. The great novel by Victor Hugo, Les Miserables, about Jean Valjean, who was starving. He needed to feed his family, and he steals a loaf of bread and winds up in prison, crime. In the meantime, what the novel shows, of course, is that the real criminal is the system that drove Jean Valjean to the act, to the illegal act, stealing a loaf of bread to sustain himself and his family. So the social contract, the institutional structure, contains within it the seeds of violence that filter down, and then the individual is blamed. So I analyze this, I deconstruct this more in far greater detail. One other thing I want to mention by way of an overview, and then I will leave it at that. One of the ultimate forms of violence, along with war, of course, was for a number of centuries, from the time that the Portuguese in the 15th century landed in West Africa until the late 19th century, when slavery was abolished in Brazil and the United States, was, of course, the institution of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. What is more violent on a world scale than that? The transatlantic slave trade and the institution of slavery in the New World, in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, that sort of violence is not what the state is set up to eradicate. On the contrary, the state protected slave owners, slave shippers, those who were engaged in the business of slavery. Just as the state protects the large enterprises today engaged in money laundering on a scale of billions of drug money laundered through banks in the Western and in the West as well as in the Eastern world. But it goes after a small-time dealer who winds up in prison for 25 years. Right? The bank may get a fine if they get caught, but that's about it. So we have this reality throughout history. And the great Cesare Beccaria, who was an Enlightenment thinker, an Italian, who wrote the book of Crime and Punishments, and proceeded to have a scientific approach about crime prevention, as well as rehabilitation of the prisoners. These are issues I deal with in the video. I invite you to take a look at it. I also invite you to join this channel. This is an educational channel managed by Asad Alim. And I thank you for watching. Thank you very much.